Quite freezing cold.
Yes, it is so cold.
Especially with that for a lady with nothing on her legs.
I know, and we don't have full control over it. That makes it a little bit difficult.
Yeah, we don't have control over our building.
Yeah.
No.
Yep, yeah. It's hard to tell. Please speak into the microphone.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Grzegorz. Nice meeting you.
I'm Beatrice. Nice to meet you.
Good morning and welcome. I hope you've all had some coffee to warm you up a little. It's a little chilly in this room, so I apologize. We don't have full control over the temperature controls of the building, so I hope the coffee's warmed you up a little. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs here at the Center on global sustainability and resilience. And we're very pleased to have a discussion this morning on what next, climate mitigation after Paris. And we're quite pleased to be able to do this at the Wilson Center. I know many of you are familiar with us. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson. And part of what we focus on at the Wilson Center is key international development grand challenges. And we see climate change as being one of these critical challenges as we think about what we do with regard to climate change. We have been working with USAID's Climate Change Office, and in particular, we have had very good support and collaboration with Kathleen Stratos and Eric Haxoxton, as well as other colleagues in the office. So thank you very much for that collaboration and support. We've had a couple events focusing on climate change issues around renewable energy, and I hope you see the summary of that discussion. And most recently, we looked at climate adaptation. So today, we're going to be looking at mitigation, and in the next, probably within the next couple of months or so, we'll be looking at climate financing coming out of Paris. So this is a really important discussion for us here today, and we're quite lucky to have 4 colleagues here with us who have been working specifically on this issue to have an informal conversation with us to talk a little bit about what next, climate mitigation after Paris. So I'm going to start with our colleague from USAID, Carrie Thompson, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Economic Growth, Education and Environment at USAID. She oversees the work of the Global Climate Change, Forestry and Biodiversity and Land Tenure and Resource Management Offices. Prior, she served as the Deputy Director of USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia, where she provided oversight to programs addressing transboundary challenges such as infectious disease, human and wildlife trafficking, economic integration, and shared use of natural resources, and also bilateral programs in China, Thailand, and Laos. So we're pleased to have Carrie here in the context of USAID, and I hope that you have managed to see the brochure on USAID's Global Climate Change Initiative. Please be sure to have a look at that. And USAID also has a very good global knowledge portal on climate change, Climate Links. So please be sure to have a look at this postcard. This is a really good and useful resource. So Carrie, as we think about the materials that we have on USAID's climate work, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you at AID are helping countries to meet their climate mitigation commitments post-Paris. What's going on?
Very good. First of all, thank you very much, Roger, Mark. It's really delightful to be here this morning. I love being in this room. It's a nice, small, intimate room, and I hope it leads to a nice conversational feel this morning. So USAID and our partners, some of whom are right here on the panel or in the audience, have been really playing a key role in helping countries articulate their commitments to the Paris Agreement in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. Going forward, we will all have an increasingly critical role as implementation of those commitments become front and center. They are front and center already. But let me just start with just going back just a bit. For USAID's part, our work post-Paris builds on the bilateral relationships we've had with 26 countries around the world in our Low Emissions Development Strategies program, our LEDS programs. Those 26 countries, which include Mexico, comprise 18% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an important group that we've been working with. And we've been laying out longer-term plans to reduce emissions as the countries grow. Part of that work has been to help some of the countries, some 11 or 12 of the countries we helped specifically to develop their intended nationally determined contributions, or their INDCs. All 26 of those countries did submit their INDCs in advance of the Paris conference. So it was really kind of the culmination of a lot of that planning work that was supported as well, certainly by other donors. Post-Paris, USAID is now pivoting to implement the nationally determined contributions. Let me say it's not the full sum of what we are doing post-Paris. I just want to make it clear that we kind of look at our support as a full U.S. government for post-Paris work as a large circle. And supporting the NDCs is a very critical subset of that. But there is other important work, including some of the adaptation work that happens outside of the NDCs. Some of that is in the NDCs, but some of it is in other kinds of documents like the National Adaptation Plans. But pivoting to implement the NDCs, how do we do that? So we're helping the countries do what they can do, what they said they would do in their NDCs, help them to fulfill their commitments. We certainly are going to continue with work that we have been doing with many of our LEDS partners all along to continue to measure accurately and set their emissions baselines so that later they can accurately and transparently report on their progress against reducing those emissions, part of their MRV work, their monitoring, reporting, and verification work. Then we're going to be helping them with the specific mitigation actions that they laid out in their NDCs, including in many cases, countries listed the specific sectors that they would be working in. Some of the main categories of our work on mitigation with the countries will be scaling up renewable energy. We provide technical assistance to countries in a series of 6 building blocks, we like to call it, which were really developed empirically from what we have found had worked really well in countries that successfully launched renewable energy programs. Protecting forest landscapes through our sustainable landscape works to reduce emissions from land use and forest deforestation, and then also promoting climate smart agriculture. I think I'll just take a moment to highlight some of the work that we've done with Mexico, since Beatrice is here on the panel with me, because it's been very illustrative of the kind of work that we will do with a number of the countries to implement their NDCs. I think having some of this work already successfully done helps show the way to countries. USAID helped Mexico. We worked in partnership to support their first clean energy auction, which we love to quote because it was a real success. It attracted some $2 to $2.5 billion worth of mostly foreign investment to support over 1,700 megawatts of planned solar and wind plants. USAID provided critical technical assistance at key moments in high-level planning with the Ministry of Energy, the market operator, and a major utility. Our specific assistance was helping to develop and revise the auction rules, help with procurement of the software that powered the auction tool, and also helping process the hundreds of offers from companies to assist in finding the most qualified companies. We will also be helping with the next auction next year, but it really is a huge success story. It also helped through stimulating that kind of competition to significantly drive down the price of renewable energy to some 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that was a tremendous success. Maybe Beatrice can tell us more about that. We also have worked with Mexico on our Sustainable Landscapes, or our MRED program, but maybe Beatrice can tell us a little bit more about that, because that's an area I think that she works in. So I think over to you, Roger.
Great. So thanks very much, Carrie. You talk about these 26 countries. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit more about the criteria to select those countries?
That was done quite some time ago. I'm looking at my colleagues in the audience. I've been back with the E3 Bureau for about 10 months, but I imagine the criteria certainly would be countries that had high emissions that we needed to work together with to reduce, that had an interest in working with us, that certainly also had globally important forests that needed to be protected from increasing deforestation. So I think those are probably the principal criteria. I'm looking at my colleagues and I'm getting a thumbs up.
No, right. So you make the case that the NDC implementation is so important at this. We're really at a unique moment of time. There's a sense of urgency. We need to move quickly. And you gave really good examples of what you've done with Beatrice and her colleagues in Mexico. Yes. Why is it so important to move so quickly now? And how is USAID helping to accelerate climate action on the NDC implementation?
It's critical to move now. I think all of us who are here today know because time is short. Leading up to the Paris conference, I saw lots of charts of what the business as usual trajectory of global emissions would be if we did nothing. And it was estimated to be around 3.5 degrees Celsius planetary warming above pre-industrial levels. With a number of the countries certainly submitted strong INDCs in advance of Paris. However, estimates from third parties suggest that those NDCs, even if fully implemented, will only get us to 2.7 approximately degrees above the pre-industrial levels, which is still too high. we have more work to do. So that's why it's absolutely critical. The Paris Agreement committed all parties to 2 degrees increase Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and best efforts towards no more than a 1.5 degree Celsius increase. So it's clear that collectively, the international community, developed countries and developing countries together in a partnership have more to do. And we feel it's really critically important to come out of the blocks very strong, to demonstrate success, to show countries around the world that it is possible to make progress against the commitments countries have made in their NDCs. And that would begin a virtuous cycle to build ambition as we go. As everybody knows, I think every 5 years there's a cycle of submitting new nationally determined commitments that the intention is that each time the ambition is boosted. So it's really critical. And we are taking a whole of government approach in the U.S. government, not just USAID. We certainly have many other departments and agencies that we work with, this Department of State, the Department of Energy, OPIC, Treasury, others. And we are developing a bit of a whole of government effort to take a look at where we might get quick wins for that demonstration effect for the rest of the developing world that is working to implement their NDCs. We are going to focus on a few countries that seem ready to move very quickly on action with their NDCs, provide not necessarily much additional financial resources, but very targeted technical assistance, diplomatic engagement, whatever they might need to really show some early results and then highlight that a bit. So we're in the process of communicating with some countries to see who we might work with to do that. So we think that would be a very important demonstration effect.
So it's really important when we talk about this 2 degree level and best efforts towards 1.5, looking to demonstrate success, make progress. And you talk about this from a technical, financial, diplomatic, and sort of early results perspective. So could you talk a little bit more about what's the relationship with the countries that you're working with? How are you trying to push that forward in these areas? And you also mentioned this whole of government approach, working with other government partners. In addition to the government, are you looking to engage any other partners?
Yes. The question is, the answer is absolutely to that, and we have some of our partners in the room today. USAID sees this really as a partnership with our work with developing countries. It is a partnership. They have laid out their plans, and we are working together to support implementation. We really see that each country, including the United States, has primary responsibility for articulating and then implementing its own plans. Certainly in terms of our relationships with our development work with the developing countries, that is in accord with aid effectiveness principles of country ownership. So really that's how we see the relationship. And USAID and other institutions, many other bilateral donors, others certainly can help support in that process. So how can other partners help? It seems to us that all should take advantage of their comparative advantage in providing help. For example, the World Bank and other multilateral development banks can provide support large investments through concessionary lending and other support. In contrast, USAID tends to provide technical assistance for policy reform and to support transactions, as we did with Mexico. And in other circumstances, we can help with de-risking investments by, for example, providing credit guarantees. Certainly other bilateral aid agencies and other institutions are working to support the Paris Agreement as well in probably similar ways to USAID. They understand how critical it is. The donor community writ large is communicating with one another about how we coordinate our efforts to support countries in their implementation of their NDCs. Germany, along with the support of the World Resources Institute, have been leading discussions about how we do that. How do we not duplicate efforts, and how do we not step on each other's toes and make it more difficult? So that's one way we're working together. certainly our implementing partners, whether consulting firms or NGOs or other institutions, are playing a critical role in helping us and probably other donors to implement on the ground the elements of the nationally determined contributions. And NGOs can play a particular role too in continuing to sound the drumbeat of the importance of implementing the NDCs. And finally, I guess I'd say it's incumbent upon all of us to disseminate lessons learned on, what are the most effective ways to support countries in doing this important work. Something we all can do.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. So I'd like to move now to our colleague from Mexico, Beatriz Bugueda, is the Director General of Climate Change Policy at the Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources, Semarnat. She has been a consultant on environmental law and policy and president of the Citizen Observatory for Environmental Reporting. She served as legal advisor and head of the Mexican Liaison Office of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation of NAFTA and has been advisor to the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs. She's been a professor of international environmental law and international politics and the environment at the Universidad Iberoamericana. So, Beatriz, bienvenida. Could you tell us a little bit? We've heard a little bit from Cara, a little bit of ways that USAID has been working with you and the Mexican government. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your government has done to commit to its INDC?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. Gracias. It's very nice to be here in this panel and to talk about what Mexico is doing on climate change and what we committed to the United Nations framework on climate change and the Paris Agreement. Mexico was the first developing country to deliver an INDC. We delivered our INDC in the first quarter of 2015, as it was requested by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the UNFCCC. And we were able to deliver this INDC for several reasons. In 2012, we enacted a Climate Change Act. And I think that it's very, very important to mention that because having a climate change law, we are the second country in the world to have a Climate Change Act at that moment, because now there are others that have climate change law. But the first one was the UK, and then it was Mexico. And we were also the first developing country to enact a Climate Change Act. It wasn't easy. You can imagine we spent 4 or 5 years in Congress negotiating this legislation, but finally we got it passed in an electoral year, which was really interesting. I'm going to write a little bit about that because it was absolutely something outstanding. There was an agreement, a consensus of all different political parties that climate change was important, and they passed the law in Congress. And that law contemplates specific targets, and it contemplates an institutional framework that we developed already in the country, and many other things, many instruments, like a registry, a GHG or greenhouse gas registry, and many other instruments. So for the last 3.5 years, we work hard in the implementation of our own Climate Change Act. And we have now the institutional framework, some of these instruments. We have a national climate change strategy with a vision, a medium and a long-term vision, which was critical for us when we were drafting our INDC, because we knew from that national strategy where we wanted to be in 10, 20, and 40 years in the climate change arena or in the climate change field. And, well, we also we already had a National Institute of Ecology, an institution in Mexico that has been working on these issues for a long time. But now this institution also has the climate change agenda. So what we did with our colleagues from international corporations such as USAID and others was to work together with this National Institute on Climate Change to develop also in-house capacity to do the work that we plan to do. And we think that was absolutely critical. There were other countries we all know that had consultants coming in and elaborating their INDCs. It was not the Mexican case. We did it ourselves, and that's why we were the first developing country to submit it, I think. And also, we were the first one that produced an INDC with two components, the mitigation component and the adaptation component of the INDC, which is critical for us because we are a very vulnerable country to climate change. There are many examples. The last one was last year when Patricia, you remember that hurricane that was coming to Mexico, and we were all so frightened because it was the first time that a hurricane was not even categorized as number 5, or how to say that in English. There was no way to categorize the hurricane. It was so big. Fortunately, it didn't hit Puerto Vallarta, which is a coastal area, very famous. Americans go there all the time for vacations. So in our INDC, we integrated two components, mitigation and adaptation. And also, we included an unconditional part for each of those two components. That means that Mexico is going to do the unconditional targets with its own resources. For the first time, we're not looking for international financial resources or transfer of technology for what we committed as unconditional. And that is 22% of GHG reductions that we plan to do with our own resources from now to 2030. That's unconditional. And then we did the numbers, the modeling and everything, and we put forward also another target that if we get the financial resources and we get the transfer of technology, then we can increase that 22% reduction to 36% reduction. And we did the same with a very important pollutant for our country and for many other developing countries like China or India or many others, that is black carbon. We introduced short-lived climate pollutants in our INDC. We were the first country to do it. There was a lot of controversy at the beginning. Should we do it? Don't do it? But we finally decided to do it. And then the other countries did as well. And we know that the U.S. has an agenda on that because we have a bilateral memorandum of understanding with California, exactly on short-lived climate pollutants. And then we also submitted our adaptation component, and we did the same as with the mitigation one. We submitted unconditional targets on adaptation. That means we are going to do it with our own resources. And one that is very important that we submitted is zero deforestation for 2030. That's a big one, a big challenge for Mexico. We ask our National Commission on Forestry to do the numbers. I mean, these are targets that we really analyzed that are no longer aspirational as the ones that we committed in Copenhagen, for example, that were conditioned to the obtention of international resources. So now we have very specific targets that we now need to comply with. What's the plan? Well, we are going to ratify the Paris Agreement very soon. The government is sending the Paris Agreement in September for the next legislative period. over Congress, but we're sending it to the Senate, and we hopefully we will have the Paris Agreement ratified this year. That's the plan. We want to be one of the first countries, developing countries, emerging countries, you would say, because we are in that category, to ratify the agreement, to send a big signal that we are committed with the Paris Agreement. I don't know if you want to, because you asked her so many questions. I don't know if you want to start asking me
Lots
so
of
many
questions for you.
but
So this is fascinating. So thank you. You know, you talked about your getting it passed in an electoral year. You mentioned the institutional framework. You talk about the instruments such as the registry and this vision, the 10, 20, 40-year vision of where you want it to be, and sort of developing the in-house capacity to be able to take this on. And you said this is what you would write about. So do tell us, what would you write about? What is the political, how was their political will to get this going? How did that happen? What happened behind the scenes? How can we learn from you? How can others learn from this experience? What would you write about?
well, I would say that I think you all remember COP16 in Cancun after Copenhagen, which was a big failure for many people. And then we had the COP in Cancun, and we were able, I think, as a country to deliver a very good COP that, how to say that in English, channeled again, you know, the process. And after Cancun, even before Cancun, with President Calderon was very active on climate change. And after Cancun, we realized that we needed to do something very fast, and that something was to start, you know, negotiating legislation. The best way, well, I'm a lawyer, maybe I'm biased, but the best way to start, you know, implementing things is when you enact laws and then they're legally binding. And I can tell you that before the Climate Change Act and after the Climate Change Act in Mexico, things are completely different. Mm-hmm. Before that, at Semarnat and the Ministry of the Environment, we had to go to all the other ministries and, you know, ask them to do something with us on climate change. Now it's legally binding. Mm-hmm. So now it's completely different. They come to us and say, what do we need to do? And that's really a change. We now have an interministerial commission on climate change with 14 ministries. And for the first time, we have a climate change special program that has 200 actions on mitigation and adaptation that have a budget in the federal budget to be done. That also makes a big difference. And I would say that there, for countries such as Mexico, many win-win situations on acting on climate change, independently from the environmental problem, which is huge for the world and for Mexico. It makes sense economically and socially. We are looking at the problem as an environmental, social, and economic issue. And there are many, many economic win-win situations. For example, you mentioned some of them. Energy efficiency in our country is critical. And the private sector is looking at that as not only an environmental issue, but a business thing, a business opportunity. And I can tell you many others like that. So climate change, acting on climate change makes sense, not only because we have a global responsibility, because we are not a large emitter. We are 1.5 is our global emissions, so we are not a big player on the international arena. But at the same time, we're an emerging country, which is not a G77 country, but we are at the OECD, but at the same time, we are a developing country. And I think Mexico has been successful in, you know, being this bridging country between the developed and developing world, and being so active on climate change has been good for us in the international arena. I think I don't know if we are still, but last year and the previous years, we were the country that received more international cooperation for climate change because what we did. So that we are taking advantage of those opportunities, and we're working with everybody. We're working with the U.S. Once we delivered our INDC, the U.S. government called our government immediately, and we, integrated this task force with the U.S. And then Canada went in and knocked the door and said we want to participate, and we now have 3 heads of state: President Obama, President Trudeau, and President Peña that are, together working on climate change. And there's going to be a trilateral meeting very soon, and you will hear very interesting messages, regional commitments on this issue. And I can speak forever, even if
That's
English
great.
is not my first language. So.
You will have an opportunity, because I know there'll be lots of questions. But it's fascinating to hear about how you talk about your going from this process of hosting the Cancun meeting and how that drove an opportunity to realize that you in Mexico needed to take action, and this bridging role in terms of collaboration. Are there other ways? I mean, you specifically mentioned this international cooperation, the task force, this trilateral meeting. Are there ways that you're working with other countries that you think are important for us to know about and be aware of? What other ways are you helping to serve as this vehicle for international cooperation on climate change?
Well, we're working with many countries, with many developed countries. We have been working very closely with the Germans, with the Danish, with the USAID, of course, with the Japanese. We have a lot of international partners, but we are now doing South-South cooperation. For example, we are working very closely with the Chileans. We introduced a carbon tax in Mexico in 2014, and the Chileans, well, they're analyzing their carbon tax, and they're looking at, for example, our model, because our carbon tax doesn't tax emissions, they tax the fuels themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's a different approach. Mm-hmm. So we are working basically with the Latin American region for obvious reasons, because we share many things, beginning with the language, which is important. And many similarities in our situations as countries. But we are also working with other countries around the world. We have strong cooperation with Spain. Spain is like the bridge with the European Union for Latin America, and we have been working very closely with the Spaniards and in an Ibero-American network of countries working on both mitigation and adaptation. And I was very pleased to hear that the USAID is now looking at adaptation as a potential area for collaboration, because, well, that's what we are looking for. In the past, mitigation has been, like the topic for international cooperation, but now we need to start cooperating or collaborating on adaptation. After the Paris Agreement that puts both issues, there's a balance between mitigation and adaptation in the agreement. We are expecting much more collaboration on adaptation.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. Thank you. So I'd like to move now to our colleague from the World Bank. Gregor Spescu is the lead economist in the climate change group at the World Bank, where he leads analytical and advisory services on economics of climate change mitigation, as well as climate, energy, economic, and fiscal policies. I know that he's a very patient man, because when I asked him how he pronounced his first name, he said, "That'll do, you're good." So thank you. Prior to joining the bank, he worked for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development as a lead energy environmental economist, and for the OECD as an environmental finance program manager. So Gregor, welcome. And I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening with regard to NDC implementation. And I know you said that you're not exactly here representing the World Bank, but you're in a capacity to reflect on what's happening within the bank and within the community. So I hope I have categorized that correctly. But from your perspective, could you talk a little bit about what's going on to support NDC implementation, and what are opportunities for partnerships with regard to NDC implementation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Roger, and sorry for my parents to have chosen this difficult name to pronounce. I'm torturing whoever I meet abroad. Yeah, indeed, I don't represent the World Bank. I mean, I'm too small for the big World Bank to represent. Nonetheless, I would like to share with you a spectrum of activities that we are engaged in supporting the NDC implementation and climate policies in general. Through partnerships. We work across the globe. We work across the sectors. We work in the World Bank group. We have the World Bank itself, which is lending to the governments. We have the International Finance Corporation that is lending to the private sector, and we have MIGA, which is providing political guarantees against the political risk. So we also have a range of instruments that we can support the countries, municipalities, businesses with. And certainly we work a lot in partnership with various development partners, including USAID and others, and I'll mention it a little bit because, for instance, we have recently joined this NDC implementation partnership that Kerry mentioned, which was spearheaded by the GIZ from Germany with the World Resource Institute as well. Nonetheless, I think it's best maybe to illustrate what the World Bank and others is doing in terms of supporting NDC by just highlighting what types of NDCs and what types of countries can be kind of identified in terms of how did they prepare their INDCs. So I think it's useful to kind of put the different countries in kind of three baskets. The first basket are the countries which either have not submitted their INDCs yet, and there are some countries like that, like Uzbekistan, for instance, at least until a few weeks ago when I checked, has not submitted INDC. And there are those countries that have submitted very qualitative NDCs for various reasons. It can be because they probably didn't have enough capacity. It's probably because they were dealing with too high uncertainty to commit themselves, which is a serious commitment, under international agreement, or because they have chosen it for strategic reasons. And that's also a legitimate reason to submit the INDC that is on the table. And we can discuss it a little bit. What does it mean, good and bad INDC? For me, it's not a very useful distinction in terms of the post-Paris reality. So these countries usually request assistance in framing their targets, in framing, what are the realistic, what are the plausible commitments that they can put on the table, both on the adaptation and mitigation side. But usually it's the mitigation that causes headache and challenges to politicians, especially if you are a country that has been, that has developed for a long time a comparative advantage in fossil fuel exports, in carbon energy intensive industries at home, the transition may be a challenge. So these countries usually seek this kind of assistance, and we are providing some upstream analytical work, upstream policy dialogue in order to help these countries, address some of the uncertainties and frame their targets. So as they can feel more comfortable in the INDC revision process, to resubmit more specific pledges later in the process. Then there is this big basket of the countries that have submitted INDCs with various type of, targets or aspirational objectives. Sometimes expressed in terms of emission reduction, absolute, against the baseline. Sometimes there are a lot of targets that are quantitative but related to energy efficiency or energy saving kind of ratios or penetration of renewable energy in the energy mix or in transport. So I think this is the largest number of countries at the moment with very heterogeneous targets, very heterogeneous INDCs. Nonetheless, what is common to them is they face a challenge of implementation. And I'll focus a little bit on what implementation means. If you are a government that has submitted a piece of paper with a lot of commitments for the country, and then the implementation is, I'm not the one who will be putting all these technologies in the, on the ground. I'm not the one who will be implementing it. So how do I create incentive structure for my people, for my firms to align their behavior, their investment decisions with the INDC target? And we have developed some analytical work, which I'll quickly show you, which we are now applying in a number of countries with some developing partners. And then there is this third basket of countries that have quite sophisticated INDCs in terms of, sometimes even the policies to achieve the targets. And there can be these kind of INDCs can be investment ready, either usually in certain sectors, in certain subsectors, and here we go with this kind of downstream work. We can provide financing, structuring financial products, structuring investment programs. It's very much downstream project level work. In the areas, in the sectors where policy framework is more or less enabling and conducive. So in terms of this policy framework, as I said, a lot of governments are struggling with this question now because they've been given a lot of models, a lot of analysis in the past to identify the targets across different sectors which they said are good for society. It's the traditional economic models or techno-economic models optimize the type of abatement technologies, measures that are least cost from the society point of view. So they have an information to frame the targets that are good for society. But society, what is it? Is it somebody who is implementing the projects? No. Society consists of millions of economic agents, firms, households. They have to make decisions, either to implement the low carbon measures, technologies, or change their behavior in a way that is consistent with the kind of emission reduction targets, or they won't do it. And here, I have an economic bias, so contrary to Beatrice with her legal bias, I believe in laws when I see the incentive structure behind them, when I see the secondary regulations, the enforcement structure that really, changes the behavior of the people, of firms, in a way that, it makes sense for them to implement the law and behave in accordance to the law rather than breaking the law, because I've seen so many countries with laws on paper and implementation going a different direction. So this is this. It comes back to the role of the government in the INDC implementation, and the role of the government in most countries is really to create this enabling policy framework to encourage the behavioral changes, encourage investment decisions that are consistent with NDC targets. And often it's very difficult because of the entrenched behaviors, entrenched systems, entrenched policies, the ways of doing things that people are used to. Lobbies, political economy issues that are very difficult to break sometimes and kind of shift. But the role of the government is also to create an enabling infrastructure, to invest in public goods, for instance, electricity networks that would enable higher penetration of the variable renewables. Which is a big issue for many countries whose electricity systems are very inflexible. So variable generation creates a lot of mess in the system, and the system operators are not very happy about it. It decreases the overall system reliability of providing electricity services to the people. So this enabling infrastructure in energy, in transport sector is extremely important. And this is also where World Bank is providing financing in the public sector. And then there is this, the financing piece of the puzzle, which is also important. And it's all about providing, facilitating access to commercial finance, as well as providing catalytic concessional finance through climate finance instruments, through carbon pricing, through carbon markets. And only by blending these different dimensions of the enabling conditions can the government, really hope to achieve this, the change in behavior among their own citizens, among their own firms, that is consistent with NDC objectives. And we have developed a certain kind of framework to work with countries on this issue, and we apply it at the moment in Morocco, with Vietnam, in Pakistan, where in Pakistan we actually are teaming up with USAID. So we are kind of finalizing the collaboration there, where we basically start from, facilitating the stakeholders' dialogue in the country about the real conditions that their investors, that their consumers face when making these decisions, whether I choose the carbon-intensive option or whether I choose the lower carbon alternative. We look at the existing policies, at the existing pricing, energy pricing, transport pricing, subsidy schemes. How the present conditions actually, influence these investment and consumption decisions? So we look at this variety of incentives that presently affect the behavior of the people and firms, and then we try to. We have developed a methodology, a modeling methodology, which is not a particular model, but it is very much the modeling methodology that takes any kind of bottom-up technology, techno-economic model, and converts this model into the financial perspective of investors and consumers. So when the model can reflect this financial perspective of investors and consumers, we can then simulate the impacts of the whole bundles of different, some often very granular policies, how the marginal changes in these policy structures influence the relative costs, the risks, transaction costs associated with a lot of low carbon technologies, behavioral measures, and so forth. So when we have it, we can simulate, all this kind of emission or energy saving trajectories associated not so much with, what if I implement that technology, but what if I implement this and that and this policy reform? How would they, how then, what kind of change in behavior can I expect from my economy? And then we also can generate this, instead of economic outputs, we can generate financial outputs. So that's so important, for instance, in terms of fiscal flows for the government, because the fiscal flows to the country will be very different if the NDC target is achieved through massive grants to energy saving projects, or if it's achieved through carbon pricing and removing energy subsidies that increase return to energy saving projects. The incentive structures will be maybe similar, but then the fiscal impact will be very different. So then you can, when you have these simulations of, of how the present conditions, where they would bring my country in terms of delivering emission reductions, how would it compare to the targets if I didn't change anything in my incentive structure? And then when we see this gap, and many countries are actually quite transparent about these policy distortions, barriers, risks that affect the investors' decisions, and why in certain countries, renewable energy auctions deliver the price that is around 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and in other countries we cannot go beyond 15 or 14. So when we have that, then we can simulate and we can engage the national stakeholders in a very transparent dialogue, where the government stakeholders and the people from the private sector, from municipalities, those who are affected by policies, they talk to each other and identify the areas that would shift the incentive structure and encourage more behavioral changes, more investments by reducing transaction costs, improving the incentive structure through energy prices, by reducing risks to these low carbon measures in different sectors, by variety of instruments, but by bundling of instruments, because this is the reality on the ground. Governments never have one single instrument to achieve certain targets. There's always a bundle, a package of instruments. They need to be tweaked, on the margins to make a change. And we're looking forward to some of these results before the Marrakesh COP, where these countries want to showcase how it works. And we believe that the implementation challenge of the INDCs is really in translating these targets that are good for society into incentive structure that is good for investors and consumers. Thank you very much.
Wow, so there's a lot there to think about and digest. So you talk a lot about the incentive structures. How do you deal with this entrenched behaviors within the systems and enabling infrastructure, catalytic concessional finance, capturing the financial perspective of investors and consumers, and this sort of bundling of instruments. One of the points that Carrie made was thinking a little bit about quick wins. Where we see evidence that these approaches are working and that there are opportunities to scale these up. Could you talk a little bit more in the context of how you've presented this, some of the quick wins that you are seeing? Who is doing this well? Where do we see some progress, and what that means for other countries who are looking at how they can do this?
I mean, from our perspective, the quick wins are usually, where our lending officers go, and then there is demand for finance to do the low carbon projects, to do the renewables, to do energy efficiency. When we see that, projects look so profitable on paper, but then there's no one wanting to actually implement them, then there's a signal there is something wrong. And usually there's something wrong either with the type of measure, kind of the techno-economic characteristics, like the cost of renewable energy, or there is something wrong with the incentive structure in a country. And the classical kind of quick win is the solar PV and wind in Morocco. It's widely quoted because the recent auctions again delivered the wind at less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and solar PV less than 4 cents per kilowatt hour. That means that in Morocco, wind and solar PV are baseline. I mean, the coal is not competitive with solar and PV, and it's because Morocco has excellent wind and solar resources, and has an enabling incentive structure and this electricity system that is not perfect, but nonetheless it's well managed to absorb this variable renewables. Look at CSP, the concentrated solar power in Morocco. It's another example that a lot of people say it's another quick win. then it's a little bit more difficult, because at the moment, yes, the two projects are kind of contracted, but we are still concerned about how sustainable they will be because of the price. It's the project sustainability hinges upon long-term fiscal liability of the government, and these projects assume their implementation schedule, assume a certain fiscal transfer to keep them running. How long will Morocco be able to sustain it? We will see. The classical example of the quick win that people believe is a quick win, and usually is in the paper, is energy efficiency. I mean, usually we believe that energy efficiency is this low-hanging fruit, but then when you actually send people to capture this fruit, then they can't find the trees. It's like everything is bushes. You try to reach it, then your hand is torn by the thorns, and then the snake bites you. And for some reason, in so many countries, energy efficiency projects, especially small energy efficiency projects in households, in SMEs, are so difficult to implement. Why? Because of all these hidden costs that we don't see in our models, and we don't see in the front pages of the papers and in the kind of advocacy narratives of NGOs. All the risks, all the transaction costs of getting together people in a multifamily house, for instance, to make a decision how to insulate their building envelope, Therefore, the quick wins are very context and country specific. And often we have to make the quick win happen by going through sometimes very painful and very difficult policy and sector reforms, which may look, like super rational for me as an economist. But when I go to the ground, when I talk to the people about removing energy subsidies to the electricity consumers, it's not an easy task. It's a painful, very difficult, challenging process. And it takes time. It takes resources. It requires a lot of support from the development partners in terms of political assistance, technical assistance, but also, as Kari said, sometimes this political dialogue, this diplomatic support also makes a lot of difference, and in shifting the kind of the priorities. Yes, it's painful, but we have to go through this pain.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to our final speaker. Bill Tyndall is the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Clean Air Policy, CCAP. Prior to joining CCAP, he served as the Vice President for Commercial Strategic Initiatives at Duke Energy. And he also worked for NatSource Asset Management, where he developed carbon and clean energy investment vehicles focused on emerging market opportunities. He has served as Vice President of Environmental Services and Federal Affairs at Synergy Corp, where he worked closely with government regulators, and has also served as minority counsel to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he advised members of the committee on issues involving the Clean Air Act and other environmental statutes. So, Bill, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you and CCAP are doing to help support an NDC implementation, and what are some of your partners in this effort?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. I must say, when you were reading all that, we all hate to hear those things, but mine is especially problematic because I can't seem to stay at doing one thing for more than like 5 years. So, once you get a little longer in life, there's a long list of things. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to USAID for inviting me. I could listen to Roger talk the way your delivery, I would actually like to take my comments, walk them over, and you can just read them, and they'd sound a heck of a lot better. So CCAP is an organization that was started in 1985 by Ned Helm, who, fast forward 30 years later, I'm replacing him as the head. So he managed to stay in a job for 30 years. And he started coming out of the National Governors Association with a Republican governor and a Democratic governor as the co-chairs of it. And it was a bipartisan effort to pass acid rain legislation. And the group helped not only put that legislation together, but they helped design this concept of trading, of putting a price on an environmental pollutant and creating a market signal to push compliance. And then one of the co-chairs, John Sununu, became Chief of Staff to the President of the United States in 1988. And so the very first bill that the administration, imagine that, a Republican administration put together, the original Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, they put together the first bill and sent it to Congress, and it included this acid rain chapter, and it included trading to bring the country under the caps. So from then, CCAP worked on a number of domestic issues. Starting at the turn of the century, it started being more focused internationally. And at this point, the organization that I inherited earlier this year is about 85%, 90% overseas. We work at the international level, at the regional level, and in some country partners on climate change, primarily working on mitigation, but also working on resiliency adaptation, and with various approaches. And, you know, a small organization, punch above our weight, I like to say, but we leverage the sort of knowledge we have and the work we do at the UNFCCC level with the climate finance organizations like the GCF. We leverage that down to our regional partnerships that we've had in place for 10 years in Asia and South America, working with individual countries, but then bringing them together and doing dialogues around things like clean energy, around nationally appropriate mitigation actions earlier, trying to build support for developing countries actually taking on climate goals. And, you know, I can brag about it because I wasn't there, but I mean, I really think a lot of the kinds of things that CCAP was working on between, you know, the dark days of Copenhagen and the amazing Paris outcome was all these different ways of trying to get, you know, the developing countries to the table to put goals on, self-defined goals on the table, and also working with the developed world to try and create support for that. And then, you know, looking at, all right, post-Paris, what should the focus be? And really, you know, no different than any other speaker, although it was brought home to me, I met with an official at Environment Canada who'd been someone we'd worked with in the past, and I'm sort of like new to the job. And I said, post Paris, you know, what should I be focusing on in terms of the international priorities and Canada's priorities? And he said, well, that's easy. It's implementation, implementation, implementation. And, you know, it's dumb, but it's absolutely true. You have 189 countries putting pledges on the table. There is a tremendous opportunity. There's a tremendous need, as all the speakers have talked about, but there's also this tremendous opportunity. And, you know, funny, I would say, and I can't say your first name either, but I would say that I agreed with every single thing you said about how hard it is to identify low-hanging fruit, all the challenges, the need to sort of start at the national level and really put this all on firm ground. And then I'd say, but I also completely disagree in the sense that it is a time, because of both the nature of the problem, because of the opportunity that we have in front of us, because of technology, because of financing being available, because of where some of these emerging economies are, that I think we can be really ambitious on a case-by-case, sector-by-sector, project-by-project basis. So while, and we have this work, we are simultaneously, you know, working at a national level, helping to identify a path forward in Chile, for instance, on how to turn this national pledge into a sort of coherent plan in terms of the financing available, in terms of specific programs that will fill it out. And then also we're working, you know, at the very specific, small town and, level working with in Ecuador in a transportation NAMA that involves putting together alternative transportation plans for small towns around the capital with a goal towards, moving people out of taking cars and trucks off the road, long term, trying to move towards electrification. We're working on distributed energy projects in Pakistan, in Philippines, in Peru. We're helping a USA, the MLED project in Mexico on the. Never done that before. Sorry, gestures were getting too much. So helping the in Mexico this MLED project which is regional. I'm wondering whether I'm going to electrocute my microphone. Is someone get out and get me some napkins?
I have a colleague.
I really have never done that before. It's a new one.
You were really wanting to make your point.
Yeah, no. Start wild just anyhow. So we're and then I would just close by talking a little bit about what I was doing. So prior to coming to CCAP, because it really, I bring this into this job. Thank you so much. So I've had something of a traditional Washington career where I worked for EPA, then I worked for the House of Representatives and worked on climate energy issues. And then I went into the private sector, and I've spent more of my career now in the private sector than in NGO or government. But I spent a little of my private sector working on policy issues, and I worked very hard with my CEO Jim Rogers on a coalition that tried to pass climate change legislation. I worked with some people I can see in the audience. We both have the tire tracks on our back to show our work, but that didn't get anywhere. And so then after that, I was given the opportunity to lead a small team within Duke Energy to look at distributed energy and look at it from the point of view of, okay, we're an incumbent utility. We have this centralized, power station, transmission, distribution. It's been the way since Edison designed it, and with the first power plant in Pearl Street in downtown New York. 120 years later, is the system about to change? So I was looking at this not from the point of view of protecting the mothership, but looking for, is this disruption, is it coming, is there a commercial opportunity? We looked at distributed energy, broadly speaking, so we looked at distributed generation, we looked at storage, we looked at energy efficiency, we focused on opportunities on the customer's premise, and the conclusion, and we actually put together a plan for action by Duke, which we took to the CEO, the board, and actually did transactions. We bought a majority interest in a solar company. We bought a majority interest in an energy efficiency software platform. And and having spent 4 years doing that, mostly in the U.S., but there was some EU, Mexico, Canada companies that we were engaged with, Australian. I can tell you that this stuff is real, it's here, it's commercial, it's reliable. The issues around integrating into the grid, while they're not a lie or something, but they are solvable, and they're solved in various situations, in various jurisdictions already. So there's this tremendous opportunity with clean energy, for instance, to move it into countries immediately. And it has all these wonderful side benefits, because, when you start putting solar panels on a roof, or you start doing changing out LED light for LED light bulbs, that's local employment. It cuts costs for customers, creates more options for customers. There are 1 billion people on the planet without, more than 1 billion without electricity right now. There's 1 billion who have electricity, but it's intermittent because of the weakness of the grid. These kinds of technologies can can cost effectively start and solving that problem. So I look at something like renewable energy or distributed energy resources. So the sort of three things I talked about broadly, as a whole, I look at those as immediately applicable in almost every city in the globe on the planet, and therefore, something that we should be focused on moving into countries as quickly as possible. At the same time, we do the work around helping the country put together the national plan and put together the financing. So it's sort of an all of the above right away, so get so excited, knock over your water glass kind of thing.
So Bill, you talk about this tremendous opportunity that can be immediately applicable, and you talk about working with Chile, Ecuador, Pakistan, Philippines, Peru, a lot of really innovative work that's happening right now. Where are you struggling the most? What don't you know that you have a sense will really help us make some significant process? Where are you stuck?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that I see is that I don't understand. So I've been involved in enough small businesses, individual projects, as an investor, as a purchaser, on the board of some small companies. I generally sort of understand the financing rules, the sort of rules of the road around financing companies, projects. Take them overseas, there's some differences. But right now we're in a world where there is private capital, there is what I'll call traditional, multilateral banks and development financing. And then there's this new world, the Green Climate Fund, the NAMA facility, of these climate-specific entities. And there's some wonderful work being done by some other NGOs, by the organizations themselves. But there is this need and this opportunity to really figure out how to leverage and optimize this very complicated, in some sense, political system to drive to drive all this mitigation adaptation we want to see. And I don't feel like, I feel like that's a big challenge for the NGO community to provide some thoughts around it, but, and for everyone to figure it out.
Great. Thank you. So let's open it up. We've covered quite a lot of ground. We'd like to hear from you, your thoughts, questions, reactions, suggestions. My colleagues will come to you with a microphone. I'll ask you to this is being recorded and we're webcasting live. I'll ask you to give your name and your affiliation and to get to your question quickly so we can take a few questions. So we'll start with you here, please.
Microphone for you.
There you are. Thank you very much.
No problem.
This is an excellent presentation. I would like to follow up both from Mr. Pesco and Mr. Tyndall.
And if we can have your name and
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Scott Bush. I'm private now, but I've been working in energy and climate change stuff since the Federal Energy Administration at CSIS on this issue. And we haven't real opportunity here to do something which hasn't been done before. I look at the last generation as sort of a lost generation, not a la Hemingway, but all of the world community finally has gotten to the position where, hey, we better do something here. This is an issue. It's not them doing it, not us doing it. And the issue is how we get our act together. Let me just suggest a few things which the UN should be doing, but it's going to need a hell of a lot of help. First of all, any new system should be transparent. The whole system, the process, the models, they should be open. Whatever you come up with should be a collaborative and peer-reviewed process, so it's not held in closet, so to speak. We haven't had that. Any new system should also identify not only what's done in the country with respect to their energy use, but how much energy they are offshoring, like deindustrializing, and somebody else is paying it. The impact of country policies suggested both nationally and internationally, what's the impact overall? We know science is always an evolving process. It has to be. That's the nature of the thing. But we've always been in a situation where no one is open and saying what is actually happening. The answer is technology development and sharing, which you're all talking about here, and what is the implementation mechanism of how we do that. I was in the Energy Department where we got together with before the Energy Department, the Federal Energy Administration, and we got the OECD nations to work together to learn from each other. People don't learn because the bank tells them this or that. They learn from each other. And we've got to have that type of process, which we haven't had, in my opinion. And just a final idea, if the carbon tax is an answer, and I think it is for some people rather, we have a system in process where if somebody puts a carbon tax on their company, that there's got to be an offsetting tax if they produce steel, for example, and it's imported. There's got to be a comparable import tax. The mechanism is there, and the whole issue is how do we put it all together? And these two gentlemen here are just super in laying out the opportunities, and we've always looked at the issues, not on the opportunities, and that's what we have to focus on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think I saw some other hands. No, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Miriam Heller. I'm an independent consultant, and I also teach a course in cities and climate change, which is one reason I'm going to ask you the next question. I address it to the whole panel. By the way, very, very stimulating discussion. We have very lofty goals at the national level, and the NDCs vary, as we know, by country. We have countries in different stages of development, and we have countries with very different political systems, with decision-making very different at the top level, and in the case of other countries like the United States, the local levels. Can you speak to some of the issues and mechanisms in place for getting these goals down to the municipalities? I understand the corporations are being addressed. And also, I have two questions. That's one. And the other one really ties into that. For some of the successes that you've had, do you have any standardized mechanisms for communicating those successes and how they may be transferable? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we had someone else. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Aaron, and I was the China's representative at COP21, and now I'm working for Solar Electric Light Fund, which is a nonprofit working for the energy poverty in developing world. So I have a question for Beatrice. So how can we learn from the Mexico experience to mitigate the economic cost of traditional industry, for example, fossil fuel, industry throughout the process? So this is my question.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions for now? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Trey Taylor. My company is Verdant Power. It's a marine renewable energy company, private sector. My question is, the UNFCCC supported University of Cambridge's leadership and sustainability, came out with something called Rewiring the Economy. And it's it's called 10 tasks in 10 years on how government, business, and finance work together for new infrastructure development given climate change. My question is, if you're familiar with this University of Cambridge 10 tasks, 10 years, what value do you see in it, and is it an implementable process for governments to adhere to?
Okay, great. And we'll take one more. Yes, please.
Good morning. Laura Tierney with the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. I have two questions. One on the INDCs, and perhaps Beatrice can speak to the legal form. Will we see them be refined or changed between now and 2020? And then the second question is, the council represents existing clean energy technologies that Bill spoke to that are ready and looking for ways to partner in developing countries. How do you advise private sector companies that are interested and have technology solutions to interface with the programs and initiatives that you all have mentioned today?
Great, thank you. So, great set of questions. I'll just cover them a little bit. How can we pull it all together? You know, transparency, collaboration, who pays, technology development and sharing, carbon tax, and what does that mean for looking at the UN system? So how do we pull all of this together? When we think of how do we get down to mechanisms at the level of municipalities, what's happening within that context? Is there a standardized mechanism for communicating successes across the portfolio that you've talked about? What can we learn from Mexico in terms of the economic costs for traditional industry? How does that being examined and how is that being presented? So there's a study that has come out of the University of Cambridge that talks about opportunities for government, business, and finance to come together. Are you familiar with that? If not, what are opportunities for thinking about that collaboration? Will the INDCs be refined by 2020? And what are opportunities for private sector partners to come in who have some technology, knowledge, and innovative solutions? What are opportunities to engage and for partnership? So, Carrie, can we start with you?
Sure. Let me give a start on some of those questions. Let me address the subnational level. When I had the good fortune to attend the Paris COP, and I'd have to say that that was my first COP, and so I chose well. It was such a such a optimistic and exciting environment, really. And one of the things I truly noticed was the huge presence of cities from around the world there. And I spoke at one event that made some reference, or we had some audience there from municipalities. And, you know, I made the comment that that oftentimes municipalities are out in front. Municipalities and other subnational levels like states, and it's certainly true in the United States. So it is clearly a level of government that we need to focus on. In USAID, we are beginning to look at some municipal climate finance activities and looking at opportunities to shape some of the massive transfers of government resources from national level to subnational levels to help shape them in climate-friendly sorts of ways. So we have to keep our eye on that level. I don't happen to know that particular study. It sounds very interesting. I'd love to take a look at it. On the INDCs, I think Beatrice perhaps can speak on the refinement question by 2020 a little more directly from the Mexico perspective. But I think the hope is, and I think it's been communicated to countries, that they shouldn't wait if they have an opportunity to boost the ambition or the specificity of their INDCs before 2020. And in terms of the question from the U.S. Business Council, I think U.S. clean energy firms, I guess because I'm the one representative of the U.S. government on the panel, I'd say the Commerce Department, EXIM, OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and TDA, Trade and Development Association. Those are the departments and agencies that are really have the mandate to promote opportunities for U.S. Energy businesses to link into our work. But it's an incredible opportunity to capitalize on, and so would encourage all firms to do that.
Beatrice?
Well, I'll begin with the last question about the INDCs and if they're going to be reviewed before the entrance into force of the Paris Agreement, et cetera, yes, in 2018, there will be like the first stock take of these commitments, and the expectation is that countries will increase their ambition. as you said earlier, what we have now doesn't put us in the below 2 degrees scenario. There are different think tanks and institutions that have already made the numbers, and the more optimistic ones are 2.7, but there are others that are talking about 3.5 degrees, which is not viable in terms of the planet Earth and what we need. So the idea is that very soon, those countries that are in the possibility to do so increase their ambition. There's a perception that many countries were very conservative when putting their INDCs because they didn't know what was going to happen and what the outcome, if we were going to have a Paris Agreement and what the agreement was going to look like. There are some parts of this agreement that are legally binding, and there are some that are not legally binding. And the reason why this very special instrument that was negotiated is basically the U.S. and the possibility of not sending it to the Senate for ratification, and instead of that, the government will adhere to the climate agreement. So, but the legally binding parts of the agreement for everybody, not only for what used to be Annex 1 countries, that is very important to say because this is going to be substituting the Kyoto Protocol, I'm sorry, is the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement is legally binding for everyone. That means that everybody will have to report with the same, methodologies, rules, etc., or that's the expectation. There will be peer reviews, there would be a transparency framework that will allow every single country to see what the other one is doing. And what I could say is like a system of naming and shaming. That would be like, that's how you say it in English. Okay, yes. Okay, because we say it in Spanish the same way. So this possibility of this scrutiny is very important. I don't see any country wanting, to be, mentioned as not complying with its own commitment. I think the INDC's structure is what makes the Paris Agreement a differentiated agreement. That was something very difficult to negotiate on the, during the long process of this Paris Agreement negotiation, which was, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That was critical for the developing world. And the fact that we have 194, I think, or how many do we have now? 89.
189.
Yeah, but if you count the European Union, then you have one. Well, whatever. You have so many INDCs, and they're different. Makes this the most differentiated agreement in the history of any international agreement. And so there's no argument to say that there's no differentiated responsibilities. Everybody's putting what they believe they can do with their respective capabilities. So, but I think I'm not answering all the questions. The other one is, I think the subnational and municipal levels are critical, absolutely critical. Unless you can bring down this to the state and municipal level, there's no way you're going to succeed in your specific or individual country. We are, for example, in Mexico trying to put together what our law mentions includes as what we call the national climate change system. That's a way of, you know, collaborating the federal government with municipal and state governments. And for example, we have now from our 32 states, 24 already have a state climate change law, a state climate change program, and some of them are already developing NAMAs. They are seeing opportunities in this, you know, to bring investment to their states. They're ones that are very active. They're ones that are not so active still. We had ICLEI, this organization, you know, coming into Mexico and also developing municipal climate change programs. And, you know, identifying specific, you know, actions or measures in this municipality and bringing the opportunity of foreign investment or financial investment. So there are things happening, but I think we need to, you know, make more efforts at the subnational and municipal levels. And for example, in our country, in the case of adaptation, the municipalities are absolutely key to work with them in this issue. There was another question, but I don't.
The economic costs of some traditional industry. How do you manage to make that case address
That's
that
a
issue?
big question. I mean, we're going to see how this develops, but I agree with both of you in terms of we need to start, you know, doing these things right away and to show how this is makes sense in terms of business, and it makes. You know, I'm freezing here.
It really is cold.
Oh my God, I'm freezing. I'm sorry, but I'm a little bit distracted.
Yes. But careful. Watch
climate
you
change,
know
but
what.
in-
Yeah, it is really.
Yeah, let me
The water
put the
isn't
glass.
freezing in front of us.
But what I wanted to say is that I agree with you, both of you, that it has governments. We need to enable, you know, these things to happen, and basically create the incentives, the economic incentives in our countries to make this happen and make this happen fast. And we need to get the financial resources of the GCF. We need to pressure, you know, the GCF so they, you know, start, you know, with the funding for the developing world really fast. So the developing world see that there, you know, financial flows coming into the countries to address these issues. That I think is really important, and that is not coming right away, as fast as we were expecting. For example, Mexico already has a project that we want the GCF to fund. We know that the type of the type of country we are, we're not getting donations or anything like that. We want, you know, big investments in the country to start implementing and to go from, you know, the planning and the programmatic work and all the technical assistance, et cetera, to real implementation of big projects in the country that can make a difference. And for that, we need to attract the necessary investment, and we need institutions like the World Bank and others to make that happen. I think that at least I can speak from my experience and my country. The private sector in Mexico was waiting for this to happen, for the Paris Agreement to happen. They were skeptical. They were saying, well, there might be an agreement, there might not be. Let's see what happens. They were there. They went to the negotiations. They're back in Mexico. They're saying, this is happening. So we better start, you know, doing some shifts and some other ways of investing for the future, because this is happening. So, in my opinion, the Paris Agreement has many good things, but one of them is that it has given and can give a very important signal to the private sector that this is going to happen, and those that are ready for this to happen are the ones that are going to be much more profitable in the future.
And is there a partnership opportunity there, to get to the question? If you have a U.S. private sector entity that has some solutions, technological solutions, what do you see as a point of entry for partnership?
Yes, technology is a point of entry, but to be really, honest with you, Mexico wants to develop its own technology.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we need to bring investment and bring technology that we don't have.
Yeah.
But we strongly believe, that unless we are able to develop our own technology, we are not going to succeed on this. So we need to attract investment to be able to develop our own technologies. It's not just a matter of buying from others the technology that we need to make the transformations that we need to do. We need to also create employment, green jobs, and develop our own technologies. And that's where we want to go.
Great. Okay, thank you. Fingers?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by building upon what Beatrice said about the NDC review process and increasing level of ambition, but I will give you the economist's take on it. The reason why Paris Agreement is so important is that it completely changed the rules of the game in the international climate negotiations. It's a really U-turn compared to what we were compared to what we had with the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there was a group of countries with commitments to do mitigation actions and those without commitments. And those without commitments were by far the majority in terms of population and emissions, especially over time. Paris Agreement basically means that now everybody has obligations with all the common differentiating responsibilities, but basically everybody is on board. And that's the major shift, major change. All countries are supposed to deliver their intended, nationally determined contributions. But this is the key. The countries agreed to all be part of the game because the starting point is what they intend and what they nationally determine. And therefore, the process going forward will no longer be the process where countries will negotiate under UNFCCC what will be the kind of emission budgets allocated to each of them. The Paris process and the INDC revision process is a bottom-up game. It's a strategic game where countries will form clubs, coalitions, and kind of blame and shame each other, bribe and threat each other, in order to create an incentive for everybody to create a stable coalition where everybody is interested in increasing its level of ambition. That will mean a lot of financial transfers, that will mean border adjustment taxes perhaps, or other kind of punitive measures that some groups of countries may apply against other group of countries. That will mean a lot of building incentives, and therefore the INDCs in the first round of the game, which was Paris Agreement, often are so heterogeneous and often are so, you may say unambitious, so vague, because this is the first round of the game. Now, in the second round, you expect, increased level of ambition, but only if the countries play effectively with each other between these clubs and coalitions. That's why you already see a number of coalitions emerging, such as Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that we have an honor of hosting with a number of partners, including ICAP and others. And I think that's kind of sets the framework that INDCs is not a beauty contest. It's a strategic game, and the outcome of the game will depend on what we do now. That's why the action is so important now, because by 2020, when Paris Agreement hopefully becomes legally binding and replaces Kyoto Protocol, we need to have a framework for the investors, for countries, to know, that a lot of the carbon-intensive long-term live investments may be risky, much more risky than they appear to be now. And this brings me to the question about, hardship to the energy-intensive fossil fuel industries. I mean, at the World Bank, where I, see it, we see a lot of countries being very concerned because of this transition and because of the challenges of transition away from their current comparative advantage to a completely new sources of comparative advantage, new sources of growth. China is a good role model for many of the developing countries because China is naturally, transforming itself from the economy that is based on investments and exports based on cheap fuel and cheap labor to a country that is now focusing its future on the increase of productivity, on the new technologies. So China is redefining itself. It also changed the dynamics internationally. But many other countries find it more difficult. I've just returned last week from Qatar, when I had a lot of discussions with the people from the Gulf countries. I mean, they are really concerned. Mm-hmm. And they are concerned about all this, the future rents of the fossil fuels. And if you read their INDCs, especially Saudi INDCs, that kind of create a pattern for all INDCs of the Gulf countries, it's basically a story that these countries are telling to the world. And the story says, there's one possible scenario in the future, and this is a scenario where we invest in the deep diversification of our asset base. That means we invest in the, in institutions, in democracy, in education. We invest in the, high-tech, high-value-added, completely new sectors, services. So we transfer our economy. But this scenario is feasible only if you guys buy our oil. If you continue buying our oil and gas, because then we have resources, we have resource rents that we can reinvest in the alternative future. Now, if you don't buy our oil and gas, and we are stuck with this stranded fossil fuels at home, we will have to invest in the fossil fuel intensive industries. We will invest in a lot of, polluting plants. And they are already doing it in a way, by building steel plants, aluminum plants, and petrochemical fertilizers. So the challenge of the future is to get these countries who are dependent on coal, dependent on oil, dependent on gas, both in terms of their exports and in terms of power infrastructure, transport infrastructure, get them engaged in the international game so as to facilitate their diversification process and deepen their diversification and give them the kind of some framework for being less concerned about the ultimate goal and benefits of diversification, because at the moment what they see is just the pain of transition. At the same time, many people in these countries, they see that, the world is now fundamentally changing. We are living in a disruptive times. And if I sounded too grouchy, I didn't want to, because I believe that we are entering, or we are one of the major, economic and social, systemic, structural transformation. Some of them have happened in the future, in the past already to humanity, but I think we are in part of the next one. But a lot of countries, a lot of people, a lot of firms in this world, they have different perspective, and they see different horizons. And at some point, we have to make sure that these horizons of different people align with each other, and that we address also the concerns of those for whom the transition to the low carbon economy will be much more difficult than for others.
Great, thank you. Bill?
Well, I'm going to pick up on that theme because, having spent 8 years recently working for the largest United States utility, facing what many think is a disruptive business environment now, there's a lot of different reactions and strategies to that. But there's some fundamental economic forces at work. The guy who's running for president on the Republican side, Donald Trump, said that if he's elected president, he's going to revive the coal industry. And it's like, so are you going to shut down natural gas production? Or, that fuel is, it no longer is competitive. Mexico does an auction in fossil for a solar plant bids in at 5 cents a kilowatt hour when, that's half the price of power in Indiana where it's 90% coal. So, I mean, it's like the economics are shifting. These pesky cars keep going further and further on less and less gasoline, so it's very hard to find an expanding market for Saudi Arabia or for Chevron. And so, that and then add on, sort of carbon concerns. So I think they're going to be winners and losers, but they're going to be winners and losers anyhow. And I think we have to play sort of honestly around the environmental externalities, make sure that we're paying attention to them. And, on the climate issue, look at, put a price on carbon and have that, add to whatever the impacts are going to be. Just a couple of other comments on questions. I mean, and not to sound like Al Gore, but the technology of the future is going to solve a lot of the issues like the transparency issue. When you have the Internet of Things and buildings are smart, I mean, they know exactly minute by minute, second by second what's going on in terms of energy consumption. So the old days of, somebody making a bunch of changes, whether at a house or a business, and seeing whether that actually saved energy, it's gone. You're going to have real-time data constantly. And also I'd say that this sort of technology transfer issue is also one that's in a way on its way to being solved in some areas, because some of this technology, like solar panels, are becoming a commodity. I negotiated to have Duke buy a majority share in this solar company that was the third solar company started by this California entrepreneur. He came out of Evergreen State in 1978 and went into solar as his, because of the oil embargo, and he just thought solar was going to be the future. He was right. He was 30 years early. But when he went into it, it was $10,000 a panel or a watt. Wow. And now it's 50 cents a watt. So and that's a sort of global price. So, I mean, there are parts of this where it isn't a technology transfer issue. These things have already been commoditized. LED lighting is another example. So I think that this is a tipping point for a lot of different reasons. There's going to be dislocation, but there's going to be dislocation no matter what because of the economic forces. And so I don't think that means we're indifferent to that, but it does mean that there's this wonderful opportunity to address this problem. It also, done right, it increases employment, improves standard of living. It brings electricity to people who don't have electricity. So there's an awful lot to gain, and the most important thing is that this amazing 189 countries. With the signing ceremony had 155 countries. That was more than had ever shown up to sign any agreement in the history of the UN. So there is this fantastic opportunity it's a challenge at the national level. Countries are all different stages, but man, is there an opportunity to do things tomorrow that are tangible, that are going to improve people's lives, they're going to create economic opportunity. So, I mean, it's so fantastic to be working on this now versus, Kyoto.
Thank you, Bill. So we've covered quite a bit today, and I think we've had a really engaged, provocative, and water-spilling discussion. So we've covered a lot of ground. I sort of have 3 key takeaways from our discussion today. The first is around the rules of the game. So we said that there changed rules of engagement coming out of Paris. Everyone has obligations. We've talked about common but differentiated responsibilities. And this message that the INDCs are not a beauty contest. It's a strategic game. And it's a bottom-up strategic game tied to incentives and ambition. And we talked a little bit about where countries are positioned in this new context. There are countries that don't have an INDC. There are countries that have INDCs a little bit more qualitative, and they're working on revising those. And then there are those who have very specific targets and aspirational targets. And the question for those set of countries is implementation. So for me, that's the context. This is the new rules of the game. This is the context in which we're operating in. So that's one key takeaway for me from this discussion today. The second is around partnerships. We talked a lot about partnerships, what they are, how they're happening. We talked about aid effectiveness principles, early wins, opportunities to demonstrate success, a whole of government approach, coordination within the donor community. We talked about partnership being financial, technical, how to de-risk investment. What does it mean from a diplomatic point of view? What are opportunities to partner that it's spur competition, and what are opportunities around political dialogue? And we talked about ways that NGOs, national and federal governments, the private sector, and donors can come together. We had a really interesting set of examples around Mexico's positioning on this and Mexico's bridging role. We heard about South-to-South collaboration, the questions around political will in Mexico, presenting what was legally binding, developing domestic capacity, financing mechanisms within Mexico, and the business opportunities that the private sector in Mexico saw. So really a rich discussion, a number of examples around partnerships, what it is, how is it happening, what are some very concrete, specific examples. And for me, this led to my key third takeaway from our discussion, which is what's next. We're sort of looking at where do we go to next on mitigation post-Paris. And there are sort of 3 components of that for me. The first was looking at the legal and economic fiscal framework. I think we heard from Beatrice the importance of this legal basis and what it meant for a transparency framework coming out of Paris, this question of naming and shaming. But at the same time, I believe in laws when I see the incentive structure behind them. So what does it mean for thinking of the bundling of instruments, capturing the financial perspective of investors and consumers, incentive structures, entrenched behaviors, and enabling infrastructure, and the catalytic concessional finance component. So we talked a little bit about that and what that meant. The second area coming out of what's next is thinking about what's the opportunity space here now. We talked about this in terms of technology. We just discussed that. We talked about winners and losers, the challenge of the future. How do we get from this challenge of transition to diversification? We heard of what this meant for the Gulf states, but we also talked about additional opportunities. We had a lot of great examples of looking at case-by-case opportunities in Chile, Ecuador, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Peru. And we said, what does that mean when you take this down to a subnational level, at a municipal level? And if you're thinking of quick successes, that needs to be very much contextualized at that level. So really quick, really good discussion on the opportunity space. Where do we go next? How do we delve into that a little bit more? What are the risks? What are the winners and losers? And what does that mean with these new rules of the game? So really rich, really engaging. And the final takeaway for me was this point about needing to figure out and optimize the political system to drive mitigation and adaptation through climate financing. What are the implications of climate financing in this new context, in this new opportunity space? Wow, you guys covered a lot. So please join me in thanking Carrie, Beatrice, Gregor, and Bill for really engaging discussion. Once again, this has been video recorded. It was webcast live. It will be video archived on our website, newsecuritybeat.org, and we will write a summary of the discussion today that you will have available to you. So please, once again, go to newsecuritybeat.org to see the recording and to see the written up summary of the discussion today. Thank you for coming, and look forward to our next event on this topic with regards to climate financing. Thank you.
Freezing.
It is freezing.